and away we go. And so I'm going to continue with what we began discussing last week. You guys had a lot of questions, a lot of comments, and so I do want to continue to encourage you to raise whatever questions, concerns, comments, disagreements you have as you have them. Don't be shy, but let me also try to make my way through some more analysis. And so I want to suggest a couple things. The first is that in the week since we last discussed this, last week I had read an annotated version of the indictment. In the intervening week, I've had time to read the indictment of the former president, Donald Trump, for retaining classified documents against the law, right? And then engaging in a conspiracy to obstruct the federal investigation to determine if he had those documents and to retrieve them. And the indictment, I think, is stunning in its thoroughness, in the preponderance of evidence it supports, in the sources that the evidence come from, the actual documentary evidence in terms of what was retrieved from Mar-a-Lago, but also the fact that many of the people who gave depositions that were critical to the indictment are in fact Trump's own lawyers, staff, who indicate quite clearly that they were lied to by the former president and that they were thus dragged into the effort to obstruct the federal investigation into the retention of documents. The other thing that I would say is that what has become clear is the kind of defense that Donald Trump is mounting. And
Yes.
on the one hand, there's a legal defense, and the legal defense, at least as it has been articulated by Donald Trump so far, although right, there haven't been any legal proceedings beyond the arraignment, the setting of bond, determination of what Trump can and cannot say to other witnesses and defendants in this case. The Donald Trump himself in Bedminster, New Jersey, indicated that he had the right under the Presidential Records Act to retain these documents. And I just have to be as clear as possible. If that really is the defense that's used in a court of law, it will amount to nothing but a fig leaf that will be rapidly dispatched, because obviously the Presidential Records Act says nothing about the right of a former president to retain classified, secret, sensitive documents. That is governed by other laws, especially by the Espionage Act. And so it's just plain disinformation to suggest that somehow the Records Act allowed Trump to retain these documents and that this is just what other presidents had done, and somehow that this is a kind of persecution of ordinary conduct. So as a legal defense, this completely fails. As a defense, not in the court of law, but in the court of public opinion, this is clearly what Trump is trying to establish, that he is the voice for Americans who have been unfairly treated by all of the main institutions of our society for something like 50 years, unfairly treated by their own elected officials, by the administrative state, by the judiciary, by the mainstream media, by corporations and the economic elite. And because Donald Trump is the first nationally elected politician to give voice to the complaints of those who are being unfairly treated by all of the major institutions of the United States, he himself is now being unfairly treated by those institutions. And I will just point out to you that Trump's gambit here is that defending himself in the court of public opinion will make it unnecessary to defend himself in the court of law if he wins re-election, right? And so the presidential election is less than 18 months away. It seems highly unlikely that this case would be concluded in that time frame. And so if Donald Trump regains the presidency, it may be that the Department of Justice policy will prevent them from pursuing this case. It is also the case that it may be that Donald Trump will be able to appoint an attorney general who will then shut this case down very quickly, right? And so that's the gambit. And I just want to say a little bit more about the legal basis for thinking that this is a plausible defense against these charges. And it depends upon a theory of the presidency, right, and the way in which the presidency is defined in the Constitution, which has had some advocates within the Republican Party, at least since the presidency of George W. Bush, and some minor advocates in the Democratic Party as well. It has never been the official doctrine of a president, although in the presidencies of George W. Bush and Donald Trump, there were many within their administrations who defended this doctrine. This doctrine is called the doctrine of the unified executive. And the basic idea is that the president, as president, is able to set the policy for all agencies within the executive branch because he is the executive in chief, right? And the issue, of course, and we can talk about, say, the post-Watergate era, in which I think this has been abundantly clear, but I really do think that the dominant position in American constitutional law and legal thinking going all the way back to the founding has been, well, we are a society of law, not men. And so to the extent that there are agencies within the executive branch who are tasked with enforcing the law of the country, it should not matter who the president is. The president may bring their priorities in terms of which laws will be most aggressively enforced, but the president should not be able to directly circumvent the law or exempt Americans from the enforcement of the law, that the enforcement of the law, though handled by the executive branch, must also be and be seen to be an impartial administration of the law. And what that requires then is a degree of independence of those in charge of enforcing the law from the president himself. And this, I think, has been a long-standing norm in the practice of constitutional democracy in the United States. It has been increasingly expressed in law, rule, and regulation in the United States in the post-Watergate era, because it was seen with Richard Nixon that there was not only with him a perhaps unique threat to the independence of the Department of Justice and those in charge of administering the law, but also perhaps a history of the growth of executive power and important cases of the abuse of that power. It's worthwhile noting today, the day after Daniel Ellsberg died, right, that what really brought Nixon down was his fury at the idea that somebody had access to documents within his administration that allowed them to make public previous presidents, not his own, abuse of power, lying to the American public, misconduct in the way in which a war was pursued. And this then led him to look for the leakers, creating the plumbers, and then the plumbers migrated over to his campaign and eventually invaded, right, Ellsberg psychiatrist's office, as well as the Democratic National Committee offices. And that, right, it wasn't just Nixon, right? It was Nixon being upset about what was being revealed about Johnson and Kennedy and Eisenhower that led to this sense that the executive has become so powerful. We need to create legal and procedural safeguards so that presidential power isn't abused. And the theory of the executive, the unified executive, says this is unconstitutional. According to the clear language of the Constitution, the president is the executive in chief of the United States, and that means that he has sole sovereignty over all of the executive agencies, and democratic accountability requires that he be able to tell the attorney general what to do, not just in general, but case by case. Now, I think this is a terrible doctrine. I don't think it is well grounded in the Constitution, and I think the effects of its enforcement would be predictable abuses of power by the presidency and damage to the rule of law, damage to constitutional democracy. Having said that, please note that Donald Trump tried for his first 4 years as president to govern in this way, to govern according to this understanding, and that he was mainly blocked by his own attorney generals, by the Department of Justice, by the lawyers surrounding him from actually doing so. But that he, I believe, has identified this doctrine as the one that he would like to put in place were he given a second term, and he is much more likely to find attorneys general, the candidates to fill that office who subscribe to that doctrine and to be more effective in reorganizing the presidency and the executive branch so that it is unilaterally accountable to him should he be reelected. But even more important in the current context, because to be honest with you, I don't think it's terribly likely that Donald Trump is going to be reelected. Although, having said that, I don't think we should rest comfortably in a world in which there's any likelihood that Donald Trump would be reelected. What Donald Trump is doing today is suggesting that Joe Biden is already behaving in the way that Donald Trump would like to be able to behave, that he has directed Merrick Garland, who has directed Jack Smith, his special counsel, to engage in political persecution of Donald Trump. And not only is this going to be his defense, right? The way in which he defends himself is going to be primarily political and not legal. His desperate effort to resist going to jail is not via winning in the court primarily, but by winning the next election. So that's the first thing to see. But the second thing to see is that this is going to be the centerpiece not only of his legal defense, but also of his presidential campaign. He is going to try to run against Joe Biden primarily by suggesting that Biden is corrupt and that he has mobilized the full power of the Department of Justice and the United States government against Donald Trump in order to prevent Donald Trump from standing up for ordinary people. The New Yorker described his stance in 2023 as messianic. And I think you can really see this going back all the way to 2015, 2016, right? I am your voice was that original slogan. Only I can fix this was its rearticulation. I am your retribution, right, has been its most recent formulation. This sense that Donald Trump and Donald Trump alone stands up for those who have been run roughshod by the economy, the government, the reigning culture and power structure of the United States for the next 50 years. This fits perfectly that narrative, and in a sense gives Donald Trump exactly what he needs to make it plausible. So we should anticipate, right? We're at the very beginning of the nomination contest, that Donald Trump will be the front runner, right? The person who has this election to lose, who will therefore get most of the media attention, something that he's masterful at doing anyway, and that he will therefore continue to convince as many Americans as possible that the United States government already functions on the principle of the unified executive, and that the only reason he is being prosecuted is because of the corrupt politicization of the government by his Democratic rival. So all of that to say, if the right independence of the administration of the law in a democracy from the partisan politics of electioneering is an instrumental norm in sustaining constitutional democracy, then Donald Trump's campaign is directed against core democratic norms. This will be the centerpiece of his campaign. This is, I think, in a sense, more valuable to him as a tool to mobilize his base than is the claim that the 2020 election was stolen. That claim has grown stale and implausible, at least for a majority of Americans. He now has a fresh and arguably more plausible case to make. And the result is that we should anticipate that a crisis of constitutional democracy that has been slowly taking hold in the United States for, I would say, roughly the last 25 years, will accelerate and deepen in the current election cycle. That is the core thesis, the core idea I want to try to defend to you today. As I say, I've taken the time to go through the indictment, and I just will say very briefly, I'm not going to review all of this. We talked about it together last week, that I do find the evidence presented in the indictment to be simultaneously highly persuasive and extremely damning. The reckless, cavalier treatment of among the most secret documents that the US government has collected, documents that, should they fall into the wrong hands, would be both damaging to national security and extraordinarily valuable to those who have them in terms of their capacity to sell them to China, Iran, North Korea, Russia. And right, the fact that they were treated in such a cavalier way means that the 10,000 plus people who traipsed through Mar-a-Lago for various graduation and wedding celebrations may have gained access to them. That the employees of Mar-a-Lago, it's quite clear, did routinely have access to them. The question of whether any of them was in fact an agent of another government or perhaps willing to sell them is something that I assume must be being investigated right now. It's not just that Donald Trump broke the law, it really is that he jeopardized the national security. You add to that the fact that the evidence is so compelling, right? That there, all of these documents were recovered by the Department of Justice, that Donald Trump used his employees to move the documents around to be able to mislead his own attorneys as well as the Department of Justice, that he then lied to and compelled his attorneys to lie to federal investigators. All of this seems to be clearly demonstrated in depositions by lawyers and staff members who are quite loyal to Donald Trump. So there's no, I think, question about perverse motivation, about there being somebody trying to protect themselves by saying this, as opposed to being compelled under the threat of perjury and prosecution to tell the truth. Um, as we've talked about, of course, there are multiple other investigations unfolding simultaneously. This one, we will have to see if it ultimately becomes the most serious. One of the reasons I think that this is so damaging to Donald Trump potentially is not only the legal jeopardy that it presents, which I think is clear and compelling. The likelihood that Donald Trump will be convicted and then have to spend 10 to 20 years in jail, should this go to trial, is extraordinarily high. So, in addition, there's the question: what do you consider to be the most egregious violation or wrongdoing by Donald Trump? Is it this case, or is it the effort to overturn the election? And as I will show you as we make our way through the material today, I think that there's a strong case to be made that many of Donald Trump's supporters don't particularly care that much that Donald Trump tried to overturn the election. They may, in fact, both not accept that as the factual description of what occurred, but even if they do accept it as the factual description, support the effort to overturn the election. Whereas the idea that the secrets, the most sensitive security information of the United States has potentially been exposed and compromised. Well, Donald Trump explicitly campaigned against Hillary Clinton on this basis. His own language is used in the indictment to indicate that he understood the gravity of what he was doing. And there is a long-standing tradition in the mainstream of the Republican Party to be security hawks, to really care about national security, the protection of secrets. And so this may further complicate the ability of security hawks to ultimately support Donald Trump, even if they are dyed-in-the-wool Republicans. It puts them in a position of dissonance with their party's leader having done something that their party has long held is a chief wrongdoing. So when we then move into the politics, and this is just to revisit information we've already surveyed, we see first, and I think most importantly, that Trump is right now hands down the leading candidate for the Republican presidential nomination. And having said that, I think it's worthwhile noting that Donald Trump was already under criminal indictment in Manhattan less than 3 months ago, and that in the period from the indictment to the president, his lead over his rivals has in fact grown. Right. So far, Donald Trump has been very successful at playing the card of persecution and grievance to say, this is not true. This is a witch hunt. And the reason I'm subject to these criminal investigations is because I stand up for you. It is helping, not hurting him with his core base. We're going to have to pan out and look at other voters pretty soon. But before we do that, we have to remember, of course, that a presidential race is not just about the candidate for one party. It's a two-person race typically, and so it's a comparison. And here we have to note the weakness of Joe Biden. We have to be honest about the fact that his disapproval rating has stayed high and steady for a long time now, and that while most Americans say that Biden is more trustworthy and honest, and this is a fairly substantial margin, right? Almost 10% advantage that Biden has over Trump. Trump will hammer away at that for the next 18 months. He will suggest that Biden is corrupt, and that is the only reason that he is being prosecuted. And we will have to see whether that strategy succeeds in closing the gap on trustworthiness between Biden and Trump, because these other two gaps, and of course, it doesn't all come down to these three values, but the other two gaps are clearly dominantly in Trump's favor, right? Mental sharpness that it takes to effectively be president. Trump has a 20+ point lead over Biden. Good enough physical health to serve effectively as president. Here, Trump's lead is almost 2-1 over Biden. And whereas Trump is the far and away leader for the nomination for the Republican Party, the majority of Democrats and independents, as well as Democratic leaders, would prefer to see somebody besides Biden as the nominee of their party, right? And so, as I say, I don't think Donald Trump will be our next president. But having said that, I think that there is still a considerable likelihood that he could be, and that should make us uncomfortable. Let me say a little bit more why I don't think he actually is uniformly helped. It's a peculiar thing to hear yourself saying, right? That maybe a candidate for the presidency is helped by being indicted for compromising the secrets of the United States and its security, but it is entirely possible, right? And so, first of all, what do Americans think about the charges? The vast majority, 2-1, think these are serious charges. But of course, there's a partisan split. But please note that nearly 40% of Republicans think these are serious charges. And by the way, independents are very much like the average voter, 2-1 think that this is a serious charge. Then we get down to, should he be charged with a crime in this case? And a large plurality of Americans think that he should, although a substantial minority, a third of Americans, do not think he should. Of course, there is a partisan split here, but please note somewhere approaching 1 in 7 Republicans actually think that Donald Trump should be charged, and nearly half of independents and a larger number think that he should be charged than that he shouldn't be charged. And so if Donald Trump is going to make this the focus of his presidential campaign in 2024, he is splitting the constituents that he needs to win. There are a substantial number of Republicans who think he should be charged. There's a large plurality of independents, and he's not going to win this election unless he can persuade those Republicans and those independents that he is merely being persecuted and that there's no justice to it. Now, when we compare Trump and Biden's unfavorable ratings, this really is a hold your nose, lesser of two evils kind of campaign. And they're very close together. And please notice that whereas Biden's disapproval rating is fairly stable and not increasing, uh, Trump's unfavorability rating has gone up and his favorability has gone down in the last month. And so there's, I think, a real risk in playing the card that you should for me because I stand up for you, and the evidence that I do is that I'm being prosecuted by the federal government, given the liabilities that attend that. Let's pivot out from Trump to the party as a whole. And here's where I want to then shift focus to the threat, not just of a very unpleasant and potentially dangerous election, but the threat to the core norms of American democracy. And this graphic shows you a comparison of the handful of Republicans who are in Congress, the House or Senate, who, when it was announced that Donald Trump was indicted, said that they were open-minded and needed to see how this played out, that it was possible that the indictment was valid, as opposed to a large plurality of Republicans, the vast majority of Republicans on record. Many have just avoided this, as for instance, Mitch McConnell studiously has done, who are on record as saying that the indictment is purely political, that it has no legal validity. And then I think we have to pay attention to the grounds on which they're saying it is political. And in particular, I'll focus on two ideas. The first is that there's a large portion of Republicans who've described this as election interference, that this is just the opening salvo in the election campaign by Joe Biden to try to tar his opponent. And then there are 33 members of Congress, including almost 10 senators, who have said that this reveals that the United States is autocratic, undemocratic, a banana republic, right? So that the rule of law is a facade, and that really this is just the unilateral exercise of power by Joe Biden. And please note the way in which these accusations, as well as Joe Biden's compunctions, I think, put Biden in a box, a real dilemma here, right? Which is to say, in order to defend himself from these charges, right, Biden has to defend the independence of the Justice Department, right, and the legal system. But in so doing, he risks, right, being the main rival of Donald Trump, underlining or giving credibility to the idea that this is a purely partisan witch hunt, because, of course, who's defending the Justice Department, the main rival of Donald Trump. And so this is, I think, not just politically difficult for Joe Biden. More importantly, I want to suggest this is indicative of the fact that one of our two main political parties has decided that defending this one individual, their leader, their presidential candidate, Donald Trump, or winning the next election is more important than defending the rule of law, the independence of the Department of Justice and the judiciary, the importance of national security and the laws that protect secrecy in order to protect national security, that this is a clear indication of democratic backsliding, as it's sometimes called, or a failure to discipline its own members and to educate the public about the importance of central democratic norms like the rule of law. Now, why is the Republican Party doing this? This goes back to things we have reviewed recently, right? The idea that the federal government is corrupt, that major American institutions have become rigged to favor the interests of the few, is widely popular in the United States today. And so there is a fertile ground. It is perhaps a winning electoral strategy. It certainly has been electoral catnip for them for the last 6 years. It is the case in particular if we look at, I'm sorry, the judiciary where the right work has to be done here. And I want to be as clear as possible for a moment about the role of the judiciary in sustaining the rule of law in a democracy. And so going back to the founding, going back to right the core ideas that were used to justify and defend and that inform the American Constitution, the sense that if all we have is partisan politics and elections, we will very quickly come to mistrust and despise each other. That we need to have some institutions that stand above the political fray, that there are some values that are more important than winning the next election, that among those values is the idea that we live in a society in which law structures and limits the exercise of political power, and that to have that actually be an institutional reality, we need an independent judiciary, and that all of us, in a sense, agree. We may not agree with the other party, we may not agree with our rivals, but we need institutional procedures that allow us to peacefully resolve our disputes with each other, that settle the question of dispute for at least the time being. One of those institutions is regular, free, fair, open elections. And of course, in 2020, we conducted such an election, and for the first time in American history, the loser of the election denied the validity of the outcome and explicitly tried to resist and overturn the transfer of power. Another core institution is the idea that we trust impartial judges to settle disputes of law. We may not agree with the outcome, but at least we have an impartial, nonpartisan, non-political procedure to settle these disputes. And I don't want to suggest that it always works perfectly, but it's better than any alternative we have right now. And as you can see, right, most Americans at this point mistrust the judiciary and in particular view it as another partisan institution skewed in favor of the wealthy. Again, it does not behoove us in this environment to have the outcomes of a presidential election turn on the question of whether the judiciary and the Department of Justice are to be trusted or are so politicized that they have to be mistrusted. The broader context here is one in which the Supreme Court and the judiciary as a whole have become much more polarized, right, and much more partisan. The degree to which the outcomes of the votes on the Supreme Court can be predicted by the party that the justice in question was appointed by has grown dramatically over the last 15 years. And this then is reflected in a declining approval rating of the court by most Americans. And I'm sorry, that's just the same diagram blown up. This then is part of this broader trend of mistrusting the federal government. And as I've suggested to you recently, the largest predictor of mistrust of the federal government is whether you believe the federal government is responsible for excessive economic inequality. Do you believe there's too much inequality? And if so, do you believe it's the federal government's fault? And that there is good evidence that the federal government has, in fact, accelerated the spread of inequality, as we've looked at together for some weeks quite recently. In addition to that, right, here I'm going to be brief because I want to move on to a little bit more evidence of the erosion of democratic norms. There are two further widespread beliefs that Donald Trump and his supporters share and have become increasingly mainstream in Republican Party politics. One of them is that the federal government is biased in favor of African Americans, women, recent immigrants, Latinos, gays, a group of causes that tend to be favored by liberal elites and that have led the federal government to neglect white working class straight people, especially men, or to prioritize the claims of others and to, as Arlie Hochschild suggests in her wonderful metaphor, put them in line for opportunity in front of good, hardworking white people, right? Then there is the additional sense that our society is transforming rapidly away from a traditional Christian society and into being a post-traditional, multicultural, perhaps atheistic society. And that in a whole range of ways, people are losing their taken for granted values. Their normative orientation has given way to disorientation, in which you can't even look at somebody and know what pronouns to use for them. Are they a he, a she, a they, right? But the don't say gay legislation, the legislation to try to prevent gender transition on the part of people who are trying to undergo it. This indicates, right, that the state is being pulled into the culture war politics by the effort to, in a sense, reverse or at least put a stop to the rapid cultural change of our society. And so we have, in a sense, these self-reinforcing dynamics: rapidly rising inequality, rapidly diversifying society, rapid cultural dislocation. You put all of this together and you've got tremendous status anxiety. This is the fertile ground, the sense of grievance that Donald Trump is feeding on, and that makes it more likely that he is going to be able to make a run for the presidency despite being under multiple indictments, and use the fact that he has been indicted to actually bolster his campaign. And so my central claim here is that under the leadership of Donald Trump, but really under trends that go back 20 plus years and especially come to the fore with the Tea Party revolution of 2010, the Republican Party has become increasingly a populist, anti-establishment party, that it appears the majority of Republicans do not trust the outcome of the 2020 election, that the majority of Republican candidates in 2022 campaigned on the basis of denying that the 2020 election had been correctly decided, and that the majority of Republican members of Congress who have taken a position on what they think of the indictment have rejected the indictment of Donald Trump as a political hit job, as opposed to an appropriate exercise of criminal investigative power. All of this points to the fact that the Republican Party, one of our main two parties, is really moving in the direction of being an anti-democratic, anti-institutional, populist party. It does not respect the idea that elections are one of the mechanisms via which we settle our political differences, that the law needs to be impartially enforced, even if that means that somebody you like may end up in its crosshairs. And we know, right, that Donald Trump is playing this card again and again. I am your retribution. If you feel you've been unfairly treated, then turn to me. We see this now really taking hold, not just at the level of Donald Trump or the members of Congress who've been elected over successive cycles because they support him, but also in terms of ordinary voters, that the voters who feel antagonism towards Blacks, Hispanics, Muslims, and gays have migrated into the Republican Party, that those who are more likely to express ethnic antagonism are also likely to want to support a strong leader who bends the rules. And Donald Trump understands this and hence thinks it's actually to his advantage that he is breaking the law. He's not really, I think, suggesting that he didn't do this so much as suggesting that this is who he is, who he wants to be seen to be. As I put it last week, that illegality is the point, right? And so in this context then, right, in which, and there's this outsider effect that political science is increasingly describing, in which when your president is in power, you're much more likely to trust the federal government, the rule of law, the main institution. When you're on the outside, when you don't have your person in the White House, your mistrust goes way up. Our mistrust of each other is going way up, right? And the likelihood that we would say that the other side is closed-minded, dishonest, immoral, unintelligent, lazy, right, has gone up remarkably from 2016 to 2022, almost doubled, both for Republicans and Democrats. There is mirroring partisan hostility that is really affecting the way in which we view reality. I've suggested to you that when conservative parties turn against democracy, when conservative parties are weak and unable to discipline their members or their constituents, there's a, I think, robust and persuasive political science and history literature that suggests democracy is in trouble. I've suggested to you that we're facing a really hostile set of circumstances for democracy. And I won't go through all of this again today, but the cultural change, the economic change, the technological change, which is eroding our basis for having a shared reality, the factual basis for our society, the demographic change in the sense that this is threatening to some people, the lack of responsiveness of democratic institutions, the decline of unions, of parties as institutions that allow us to participate, the authoritarian drift of one of our two main parties, the epistemic crisis in our media sphere, and the resurfacing, of populist nativism all make this a very difficult time for democracy. I've suggested that pillars of democracy, the right functioning of conservative parties, the media system, the responsiveness of elected officials to their electorate, are all eroding. And what we see when we look at the data on this, right, this is a general electoral index and a liberal democracy index, in which you can see from the beginning of the 20th century through the 1980s, the United States became more and more secure in the way in which its citizens endorse democratic norms, in the way in which its institutions actually operated. That trend came to an end, perhaps not coincidentally, around the end of the Cold War, but it remained stable for the next 20 years. But what we are seeing is, in the last decade, genuine evidence of democratic backsliding, of erosion. And to show two other indications of this. The first is, right, do you think it's important to live in a democracy? And as you can see, people born in the 1930s, 70% of them said yes. People born in the 1940s and 1950s, it was close to 60% of them who said yes. By the time we get to the people who were born in the 1980s, the people who are fully of age today, we're down to less than a third. Similarly, is it acceptable for the army to rule, for there to be military rule in our society? And again, right, especially for the young people, we're up to a quarter of them saying yes. The overall population, it's around 15%. Both those figures have increased dramatically over the last 20 years. So all of this to say is that if we want Trump to be prosecuted, if we believe he should be in jail, if we believe that the principle of equality under the law demands that no matter how rich and powerful you are, if you clearly break the law, you should be prosecuted. That in particular, because of the power vested in him, the only reason that he has the documents is because he was the president, that especially those individuals need to be subjected to the rule of law. So there are good, powerful reasons to want Donald Trump to be held accountable. But we have to note and really take seriously that in 2023, as we enter the 2024 electoral cycle, this is not a clear-cut damning of the individual indicted for being indicted. As opposed to that, at least for his core constituent, this may strengthen as opposed to weakening the case for Donald Trump. So I'm suggesting we pay attention to some deeper truths, that democracy is a fragile institution, that it doesn't just require a constitution and institutions that conform to the Constitution. It doesn't just require good laws, it requires additional institutions like parties that support the rule of law and the democratic process, and citizens who have internalized and come to understand the value of democratic institutions and who therefore adhere to the norms that those institutions rely on. And so when we focus on the rule of law, equality under the law, the legal protection of the democratic process, we need to do more than rehearse those values. We need to recognize that those values ring hollow when it does not credibly result in equal outcomes for all. That has been the case in the American economy and American politics for much of the last 50 years. We have to repair our democracy before we can expect our democracy to deliver on the prosecution of criminals, the rule of law, settling our disagreements for us. I know I've made this case to you before, but I think particularly in light of this recent indictment, it's extremely important that we take this to heart and recognize, yes, we may want Donald Trump to go to jail. No, we should not expect this to solve all our problems. And in fact, the indictment is going to play out in our politics in a way that is going to be very dangerous. It's really going to stress our political system and culture for at least the next year and a half. I'll stop there. I thank you for allowing me to get through everything I had to say to you today. I can't imagine but that you have a whole bunch of questions, comments. Who wants to start us out? Go ahead, Flossie. Unmute yourself, please. There you go.
Let me get somebody like Beto O'Rourke or Michael Beschloss, somebody who represents the younger generation and with Biden's blessing to take his place. We need a younger person to stand up against Trump. Surely there must be someone who wants to do it. I ask for your blessings now. Whom do you recommend?
So first of all, I have to say, if there were somebody obvious out there,
Yeah,
I think that the call for Biden to step aside would be much stronger, right? So let us note two things, right? The first is that Biden does not appear to be willing to step down, right? And please note that the last time, right, that the Democrats faced an internal challenge, a primary challenge to an incumbent president, was when Ted Kennedy challenged Jimmy Carter in 1980. And the result of that challenge was, well, I don't want to say the result of that challenge, but it certainly contributed to Jimmy Carter losing to Ronald Reagan, right? And I think particularly when it's Donald Trump who's likely to be on the ballot, no Democrat wants to do anything that increases the likelihood that Donald Trump will be president. And if a Democrat running against Biden in the primaries is going to have that effect, no Democrat wants to have that on their conscience, right? And so that's the first thing to notice. The second thing to notice is that Joe Biden wants to claim that he's been a successful president. And if we're, I think, judging his presidency on the merits of the policy that has been passed, there's a very strong case to be made. But having said that, clearly the age issue is bedeviling Biden. I think the other thing that many Democrats are saying is if this is going to be Biden v. Trump 2, right? If Trump is the front runner for the nomination, Joe Biden has already beat Donald Trump once. He actually was president during the midterm elections, in which the Democrats did much better than anybody expected them to do. Perhaps this is not such an unfavorable race for Joe Biden. Now, I will say he's 4 years older. It appears that his speech impediment is more pronounced. He has fallen a couple times, and of course, the Republican Party is making hay out of that to suggest that he is feeble. Let me then add that I think one of the things, if you pull back from electoral politics, you have to ask, what is the main claim? Often it's the main emotion associated with a candidate. I think, right, Biden's main claim is competence in governance, right? That he has gotten things done, that he's not interested in mere showmanship or capturing attention, that he works with the other side, but that he has his principles. Trump is clearly the candidate of anger and grievance. And I guess I will just say that if the campaign comes down to Biden and Trump, and it's really a choice between competence and anger that we have the last 8 years, what happens when a president who governs from anger as opposed to a president who governs from competence is in the White House? And that enough of us will say, well, we don't particularly love the fact that Joe Biden is old and not terribly charismatic or exciting. We do recognize that he has accomplishments, and we recognize the dangers associated with the alternative. Flossie, I know I'm not answering your question, but I'm trying
Yes,
to
you are.
say, in a sense,
No,
Beto
you
O'Rourke has won one
have
election.
made it very clear that anyone who is over 80 had better speak up for Biden.
Yeah, yeah,
Yes.
and we've just done a whole
Gather us,
class
yeah.
together on age discrimination as well. I think there is something that Biden has to say on his behalf, which is, I may be old, I may have a speech impediment, I may stumble and fall, but look at my record, right?
Yes.
And tell me that I'm diminished. I don't think you can say that. Compare that with the previous 4 years. I don't know if that flies beyond the walls of Piedmont Garden. Let us hope. John, you've had your hand up for a while, and then Wilma, I'll come to you.
It does seem to me, I think there is certainly no choice other than Biden to nominate. But on the other hand, at his age, I think there's more attention than there would otherwise be to the vice presidential candidate. And I don't think many people think that Kamala Harris is the strongest vice presidential candidate you could ever have. It's remarkable how little she's been in the news in the time that she's been vice president. But it's a little hard to pick somebody else. But I was wondering what you think of the idea of picking Tim Scott as the Biden's running mate.
And you wrote to me about that. I don't know if you got my reply. My reply was, does that mean Kamala Harris has to be Trump's VP?
So you did. Yeah, sorry, I couldn't think of an answer to that, so I didn't bother.
Having said that, look, I've got immense respect for you and Ruth, and I love where the idea came from. I just, if Biden is looking to replace Kamala Harris, and there's no indication that he is. And I, by the way, before doing the lecture, I didn't put it on a slide, but I look at Kamala Harris's approval ratings, and they're pretty dismal, right? And so the fact that Biden would be the oldest president in history, if we do the actuarials, we recognize that there's a decent chance that he wouldn't complete the presidency. So we take more seriously who the vice president is. By the way, the same thing is true for Donald Trump. Then who his vice president is matters greatly. Whether it should be someone other than Kamala Harris is one question. Whether it should be Tim Scott is another question. And it, I see the attraction, right? Which is to say, it's the ultimate gesture of bipartisanship, and it gives credibility to the criticism of Trump when it's coming from somebody who has been a Republican elected official from a southern state. But having said all of that, I think it's got a snowball's chance in hell of actually happening. So I think you better start printing those Biden Scott signs and getting as much attention as you can if you're going to try to make this happen.
Well,
Well,
my son
right.
suggested that I tried writing a letter to the Times and they didn't publish it. My son said I have to get it onto Twitter, but it would have to be as a reply to some massive circulation Twitter thing, and I don't actually know how to do that. So I'm at a bit of a loss as to where to go from here. But if Biden said he wanted Tim Scott as his vice presidential candidate, I think he'd get him.
Yeah, I don't know about that. But presumably he wouldn't say it at a press conference. He would use back channels and determine whether Scott was actually interested in it.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, right.
Yeah. Wilma, go ahead. I'll give you the last question for today. Oh, you're still muted. Now you're not. Go ahead.
Okay, I couldn't agree with you more about the need to reform our policies and change a lot of what's wrong with our country. There is so much that's broken and wrong with our country. But given the gridlock in Congress, and given the fact that the Republicans don't want any change, it's not going to happen. It can't. I don't see how it could happen. What Biden has done in the interim is just enact some marvelous policies that have been helpful. But there's something definitely wrong with the Democrats. They don't know how to message. They don't know how to get that across. And I don't know that they ever have. And I don't know what we could suggest that would be helpful in this realm.
Yeah, and this is the anger versus competence frame that I'm suggesting. Anger's a lot louder. Anger's a lot more salient, right? It grabs you by the collar and you pay attention to it. If all you're saying is, look, I got legislation passed, I think you got to add immediately. Oh, and by the way, that legislation created 800,000 jobs, right? That legislation is starting to repair our crumbling infrastructure. That legislation is, it appears, really prompting a revolution in the adoption of green or sustainable energy alternatives, maybe in the nick of time for the United States to actually meet its obligations under the Paris Accords, when Canadian wildfires are making it dangerous to go outside in half of the United States at a time, right? That there are things that Biden needs to be saying to take credit for what he's doing. Having said that, Wilma, to come to the first half of what you said, I think precisely in these circumstances, we cannot use federal government gridlock, especially congressional gridlock, as an excuse to not get things done. I'm talking to you in a state where the entire power structure is controlled by the Democratic Party, right? And there are cities and states and regions throughout the United States where that is true. The state government, the local government cannot do what the federal government can, but it's not powerless. And so in terms of building housing, creating jobs, cleaning up the environment, regulating greenhouse gases, reforming policing, there is so much that could be done that would, in a sense, exemplify to the rest of the country, this is what it means to be governed competently by people who adhere to the rule of law and believe in the United States as an inclusive democracy with equal opportunity for all. That we need to walk the walk in the locality that we're in, and then perhaps we model this for the next president in the way that what the progressives and the populists did in the 1870s and the 1910s, created models for FDR and the New Deal in the 1930s and the 1940s. That we really can't use federal gridlock as an excuse if we're in control of the state or the local government. There are things we can be doing there as well. All right, everyone. Wonderful to be with you. Take care. I'll see you next Saturday. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.